Hello and welcome to another episode of the CG Garage. This is episode number 484, featuring Alex and Tim Porter, who are the founders of ModTech Labs. Alex is the CEO and Tim is the CTO. They're really cool people. I met them over at the Real-Time Economics Summit back in 2023. We've been talking quite a bit since then. They do some really interesting work. Their main focus of ModTech Lab is actually a pipeline. They've been doing a lot of work in terms of pipeline, creating APIs that enable pipeline to be faster and easier, specifically in the real-time world. And they've been looking at a lot of stuff in terms of virtual production, optimizing workflows for virtual production. Tim has a lot of background in the gaming world as well. So it's really, really interesting to hear them talk about what that's all about. And we talk a lot about the state of virtual production and in terms of real-time and the industry at large. So really cool to talk to them about this. This is a fairly technical episode. We get really into the weeds in terms of what an API does and what they're doing in terms of that. So really appreciate them sort of coming out and telling us about ModTech Labs. But if you want to really know more, like what exactly do they do and do in their company and see sort of demos, I actually suggest you go to their site. So go to ModTech Labs and check out their site. They have a section called demos, and they'll show you a bunch of videos of some of the tools that they've developed that you'll be able to implement inside of your company and your pipeline as well. So really cool stuff and really interesting. We've been talking to them obviously about a lot of stuff that's going on in our world. So really cool to have them onto the podcast, and I really appreciate it. Okay, couple of announcements. If you want to know more about our products, just go to chaos.com. I want to mention again, Vantage 2 Update 5 is out. We've done a lot of updates to this, including support for VR using OpenXR. We've added some animated vegetation through our Cosmos library. So if you guys want to add animated trees, etc., those are available now inside of our Cosmos library. We've also added some new shader supports, including rounded edge corners, and we've added ACES CG support as well. Corona 12 also had a big update, including export to Vantage, which is really cool. So now you can go directly from your Corona scene to Vantage in real-time ray tracing, which is awesome. We've added things like scattered instant brushes, curved decals, and new virtual frame buffer 2, which has got a lot of new changes to it as well. So very exciting. Again, to go to chaos.com for that information. In terms of events, we've got a couple that I would like to let you guys know about. First is the D2 conference that is happening August 29th through the 31st in Vienna. I love the D2 conference. It is one of the premier ArcViz conferences that happens out there, and the guys who run it are really awesome. So definitely go check it out. And if you happen to be in London, beginning of September, specifically September 5th through the 6th, there's going to be the Rainbow Conference, which is really awesome. I was there last year. Unfortunately, I cannot be there this year, but I do want to call attention to it because we will be showcasing a short that I've been working on for a long time. It has been something that has been a blast to do, but it's also something that we've been doing in terms of kicking the tires on Project Arena. So it was a first production short that's been done with Project Arena and turned out amazing. And it will be premiering actually sneak premiering over at the Rainbow Conference. And if you would like to see it, definitely want to sign up to go see it in London, September 5th through the 6th. And we'll have some very cool speakers that are showing up for that as well. Again, all of this can be seen at chaos.com/events. And that's at chaos.com/events. If you want to know more about the podcast, just go to chaos.com/CG Garage. That's our podcast page. If you'd like to follow us on Facebook, it's facebook.com/CG Garage Podcast. If you'd like to watch any of these podcasts, they're available on our YouTube channel where we post all our videos, including the podcast, and that is youtube.com/Chaos Group TV. If you'd like suggestions to suggest podcasts or people to have on the podcast, just email us, labs@chaos.com. And we've gotten great suggestions in the past. So don't forget, just send those in. We do respond to many of those, probably almost all of them, and try to see if we can get some of those guests on. Again, that is labs@chaos.com is the email. But for now, please enjoy episode number 484 with Alex and Tim Porter.
Welcome to another CG Garage, where the Chaos Group talks. You'll know it's over when the last bucket drops. We're gonna fire off rays in high dynamic range. We know that ambient occlusion is passe. Global illumination won't lead you astray. And while image-based lighting is really swell, you need to make sure everything has Fresnel.
How did you guys get into computer graphics? Like what was the incentive there? Because I know you guys have done stuff in games and a bunch of stuff like that, but what got you into computer graphics and all of that?
So my background, well, if we go back to like my parents, my mom was a graphic designer before it was even a thing. She self-taught, herself all the Adobe, suite sort of generally, right? She's a lot of Photoshop, a lot of InDesign. And, she worked in magazines and a ton of other things. So that was all around me my entire life.
Sure.
And ultimately I went to college and decided that my path was interior design and construction technology. So AutoCAD, Revit, visualization of places and spaces. So I come from the other side of 3D.
Sure.
And that's fundamentally where, my interest in sort of origination started. And then Tim was my gateway drug to M&E and sort of other broader uses of the technology.
Well, how did you guys meet?
How did we meet? Oh, we met online on OkCupid.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah.
And you both had an interest in graphics. Was that part of it?
She was working at that time. You were a nanny, right?
I was a nanny and a doula.
Yeah.
And
wow.
I'd finished my degree, but I was doing more freelance, like 3D design stuff for other designers. I wasn't working full time in interior design yet.
Wow. Okay. All right. What about you, Tim? How did you get into computer graphics?
I mean, if we want to go all the way back, since that's what we're doing, my parents, my mom worked in radio and television. So I was taken to like radio stations and television stations and run camera. She tended to be in, mission control and stuff like that. So, I would be, let's do fades. I'd learn about all that stuff as a kid. And she did, audio and video editing. And then my dad's on the complete opposite side. He's an electrical engineer. So,
right.
As much as that sounds bizarre, that obviously shaped my life, being a technical artist and then a pipeline TD. That makes sense. Right. Little art, little that. I end up in high school really being interested in computer graphics, and I did that for my high school. And so this would have been like 2000, and picking up and doing that. Ended up winning a couple awards, and then I kind of shelved it for a couple of years. And went to Florida. And then I was like, I really did enjoy that when I was in high school. And I was trying to figure out like what I wanted to do with my life kind of situation. Mm-hmm. And it was one of those things where I went to Full Sail and they're like, hey, you can get at the time, associate's degree in 18 months or 12 months or something like that. And I was like, cool, let's do it. And then I did that. And then halfway through my associates, they did a bachelor's. And I was like, sure, a bachelor's degree is going to be better, because if I need to go either to any other country or if I need to do like government work or something like that, having a bachelor's degree is really kind of the only way to go. And so I did that. And then I worked in the industry. So I worked in video games originally I was an artist, and I was an environment background artist. And then I became an art director, worked at like Critical Mass Interactive with Matt Sibilia, the old Origin guys. So you're talking about like OG Ultima Online stuff, Billy Joe Kane and Richard and all of those guys. This is a spinoff studio that was from that. And I became an art director. And then it was one of those things where as I was working, I started doing more and more scripts because, people on my team were like, I want to do this cool thing. And we're all like, there's only 12 of us. I don't know. And then I was like, let's take this script, and started putting it together. And then little by little, I became more of a developer. And then, by the time I got up to Canada, I worked at Real Networks as a technical artist, and then I became a pipeline TD at Sony Picture Imageworks. And then Alex and I started a studio in 2016, right after I had worked with 2-Bit Circus. So, that would be all the ex-Atari guys and all of that fun stuff. And then we started an XR studio, and this spun out of that studio because we were doing really cool projects, and we sat down with an investor. And, you know, we had these 20 different ideas because when you work doing XR for major corporations, you end up picking up intellectual property as you go along and ideas and cool things. And he was like, oh, what about this one? I was like, you don't want to talk about that. Like, it was pipelines, automated systems and tools and things like that. I'm like, you're not going to know what this is. And he was like, no, actually, I have a friend who's in Pixar. And I'm like, all right, like delve in. And he was like, hey, if you turn this into its own company. So it was not a joke like Silicon Valley, where we didn't even have a company. There was none of that. And he was like, here's a check made out to Montech Labs. We're all like, well, hopefully the name's available. Let's go.
Wow. Okay. So literally you're like, oh, wait, no, it's a compression algorithm. Wait, what?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Pied Piper all over again.
Right. Interesting. And so they were interested in your pipeline. Like they thought that your pipeline was what they wanted to invest in.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you thought you had a studio with a cool pipeline.
So, yeah, I mean, that was, I mean, I'll let Alex tell it. She tells it better than I do, I think.
They're both right. As a reality, you know, I started getting into, you know, looking into the venture industry and understanding how that world worked and why someone would give you money for an idea, because it was very bizarre to me. Still is kind of bizarre.
It is.
And when we met, you know, our investor, he very much, you know, understood, because he had that background of that, you know, that clarity from his friend in the industry. And that was the first conversation that like went beyond expectation and really, you know, set in motion us productizing the internal pipeline that we had built. You know, we thought, you know, we're building this so that we can scale our services. But what we really realized ultimately is that if we built it to scale other people's, you know, services and help them, you know, bring their content to life, then we could actually bring it to market in a more meaningful way, which is a powerful opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, I want to get back to sort of the history and investment and the sort of the temperature of the investment world at that time, which was kind of like everyone's investing in different companies and there's so much interest in all this different things. But before we get too much into that, let's get a clarification, quick check. What exactly is your company? What is your pipeline? What is the thing that you guys do that's different, that's sort of got this guy's interest?
Absolutely. So Montech Labs is an automated tool set to make content workflows more simplified. So what we have fundamentally is API first solution with many, many microservices across the content creation, optimization, and conversion workflows that can be built into product sets like what we have with ModOpti, which is a virtual production optimization tool specifically, you know, built for VP stages to make sure that it plays that at frame rate every time. And then we also have, you know, all of these microservices that can be compiled into other types of workflows. And that includes things diving into photogrammetry, Gaussian splats, NeRFs. Do you want to use these pieces of content to, you know, fill out your vision? And then conversion side is really, you know, how do you execute in the format that you need it in, whether that is a cross media application, so film, you know, television, all the way into AR, VR, web, mobile, you name it. We have an entire tool set that is configurable that can make that process more simplified.
Okay. So you're really trying to find a way to get people their data in a much simpler way without having to think about too much what they're trying to do.
Yeah. And as well, what they're doing on the back end. I think the big thing, you know, when I worked at studios and we would have these pipelines, is that adding in a new section, a new node, a new anything was always a Herculean task. And it had to go through so many checks because there were so many things that were interdependent on each other. And so instead, what I did was I did it backwards. I took a look at the way that the industry works when it comes to microservices, when it comes to being able to build processes. And we're talking about coming outside of the game industry, outside of the film industry entirely. I started looking at groups like Google. I started looking at groups you know, like AWS, and like, how does all of that infrastructure, how does YouTube deal with thousands of people uploading data and it needs 20 different versions? And so I got really deep in how things can work backwards without the interdependencies that work on them. So we can do crazy things like add in entire nodes or change out what we do for processing for like photogrammetry in like 2 to 4 hours. And that's almost unheard of inside of the industry, being able to go, I'm going to do this entire pipeline so quickly. And so for us, when we do these interdependencies, so like Alex was saying, we have this photogrammetry pipeline, we have this, virtual production pipeline and things like that. All of those tools already exist since it's part of an API. It's just how you call them in what order. And the system knows I wanted to do this in this order. It understands how to deal with that data internally. And then if somebody makes a mistake, they're like, oh, I want to go from this process to this process, and there's like a jump between those. These are the processes that should fit inside of there. So, for example, if anybody's really deep in how deep this rabbit hole goes, if you go, okay, I want to do a remesh. Remesh does things like blowing away the UVs. And so then you have to go ahead and make UVs, and then you have to go ahead and reproject the textures, and then you can get your asset. And so it understands, cool, someone meant I want this and I want that. But what I really meant is I want this to get that. And so the big thing is, it's like, how do you scale up pipeline guys? And then on top of that, how do you make it to where artists can really enjoy doing tools again and be inside of tools and do geeky things and then experiment?
But your main focus, just to make sure, because I know what you guys do, but just to make sure that everyone understands, your main focus is on tools that are for real-time solutions. Am I correct?
It's a good question. Most of the tools that we have are focused on real-time solutions that people are dealing with. But we do have photogrammetry tools. We have Gaussian splat tools. We have... Which also can be real-time. Video. And we do... So I think the thing that we want to look at, and this is going to get like metaphysical when it comes to 3D data, is I don't see 3D data any different no matter where it's going. Okay. And I think, and this goes to the world of transmedia and how content will be done in the future and how people are doing content. The idea of I have this movie grade content and then it can get optimized so it can work in a video game it's available. It's there. And those are the tools that we have implemented. We've done a lot on the real-time content side for optimization, cleanup, and things like that. But it doesn't matter what comes in and how that goes to that. It also could just not get optimized. You end up having a 50 million polygon rock that comes out. That's all capable. So I don't know if I would say that we are massively focused on that, but we do have a lot that's in there because the industry has done so much over the last 4 years to focus on real-time production.
Sure. Now let's talk about this a little bit. There has been that promise of I'm going to build the asset once and then I'll use it in a movie and a video game, right? And it doesn't work. It's never worked. Yep. It's never, ever, ever worked. And people have tried it a million ways and pitched a million companies and won millions of dollars in revenue under that promise. And I haven't seen that work. So why doesn't it work? And what is the way to make that sort of figure that out?
Sure. Alex, how about we start with the intellectual property rights version first, and then we'll talk about it on the technical content side. So Alex, talk about why it didn't work, and then of course, why it now will work, and then I'll talk about content.
So actually a great example of this is, so Sony just purchased Alamo Drafthouse Cinemas, right? They could not have owned Alamo Drafthouse Cinemas because up until COVID, large media companies could not own their distribution, right? It was it was monopolistic. That was passed a long time ago and flipped on its head for streaming to be opened up. So Sony had Crackle briefly, and they decided, like many, companies, that they needed to pivot their model, right? I'm not going to surmise to understand exactly what went on, but we all know that streaming has been challenging to monetize, right? What that really boils down to is you have to come up with alternative ways to distribute your content. So them purchasing the cinema chain, right? There are just under, I think, 50 theaters, and they're in a few states. It's not a huge franchise, but it's actually under a new department in Sony, which I believe is called the immersive media or entertainment media or something like that. And so the reality is what they're looking to do is build out experiences. They want to make distribution experiential. And we've seen that model works really well for companies like Disney, right? We have, or NBCU, we have theme parks, we have experiences, we have games, we have all of these sort of multimedia faceted pieces. And we're starting to see those come to fruition more and more and more. And so Sony is a really interesting example because they have end-to-end process, right? They have everything from the cameras to the stages to the teams. They have Fixo, they have Torchlight. They are building out this entire ecosystem from content creation to distribution, consumption. And so with that, we're looking at how do you scale this thing? They have a VR headset, right? They have the tablet with the 3D tablet. And so there's a massive amount of opportunity. But what's fundamentally sort of the missing piece that we're looking at is how are you taking all of that content and all of that IP and distributing it foundationally throughout? And our tool, among others in the industry, we really built this with that cross-media functionality as a core. And the biggest piece is we are agnostic, right? Tim mentioned this a little bit, but we take in a ton of different types of data. So everything from photo to video to scan to model. We're not specific on that. And then that, the whole process of what we do to the data is really dependent on where it's going. And that can all be sort of tailored to, hey, we want to output it for 15 different specs of devices and capabilities. And we have actually done this with a large media company. And we actually output from everything for a virtual production stage to a smartwatch. Why a smartwatch? Great question. I don't know. Just to poke, I think.
Sure.
So I think we're looking at it in a different way and coming with Tim's experience, especially in games and film, and then our work together in XR and understanding how all of those things are actually foundationally the same. And everything has been migrating to more real time, just like you mentioned. You're blending all these technology stacks more efficiently and effectively than they ever have been before.
All right. So technical side, why did it not work before? There are a lot of different reasons why it didn't work before. I think 95% of it comes down to the interest in studios and the amount of funding that they have placed to go ahead and go towards that direction. There was a decent amount of money that had gone in to try to figure out, especially in the early 2000s when making game movies was kind of a thing. I really think it was one of those things, as you saw, the amount of money that they actually did end up putting into games was not high enough. And it wasn't until, the later 2000s when film and games crisscrossed in the amount of money that came out that it starts becoming a much more viable area. And so I think a lot of it really comes down to the backwards movement of this. When we talk about what is the want and what is the push that the studios have, now they have an economic incentive to spend the money and the time to work on their pipelines. The dangerous part on this, and this is just like every single studio, and the reason why every single studio has a problem with this is every single group is massively siloed. One group will spend one direction, and this is how they deal with their data. This group will do this data in this direction, and this group will do this data in this direction. So when you go to build pipelines, that means you're not just building a pipeline, you're building 8 pipelines. And all of those 8 pipelines then need to converge, so then they can now be shot back out in a hub and spoke kind of fashion. So they all go back into the core type of a data, and then that data then gets shotgunned back out to whatever different media file format or output that you're looking to do. But what if you had a really interesting system that was built the backwards way that most pipelines are built? You end up having the ability to go ahead and say, well, this team does this pipeline like this. Here are all the nodes and the way that they build their pipeline. This is how they do their process. Cool. Now, this is the way that other team does a pipeline. Cool. Can we hook this pipeline that was just put together by this system that can be built in this macro fashion into this other pipeline. So you end up having these micro pipelines that go into macro pipelines. And then once those macro pipelines end up getting fed out, then you end up having different versions that are viable for different use cases. And so when you're looking at it, it's no longer becomes a hub and spoke. It becomes a spider web in the way that it deals with data. It, at that point in time, can then continue to bifurcate as things go along. And so then people go, but it's fully automated. How do you deal with things like that? Well, what's the major thing everybody chit-chats about now? AI, machine learning algorithms. So our computer vision models have gotten so much better. What was the problem before? How do you get the data? How do you get the content? Now we have lots and lots of easier ways to go ahead and generate, create content. And then you can see when things become a problem. But when you also can make these pipelines so quickly, and you go, oh, that's a mistake, then you can change the pipeline once again very quickly to fix for those mistakes. You can add in little nodes here, go, nope, that's wrong. Instead of as 80% of it goes this direction, that other 20% then goes up and goes into a different pipeline. So these pipelines can be intelligently bifurcated as they go along based on errors, based on previous runs, based on different ideas and different thoughts. But to be able to go ahead and orchestrate that in the background, you have to build these pipelines as a system that builds pipelines. I think the only way that you can really see it is to look at it backwards so that you're looking at what you want and where you've come from, and then you have to fill in the gaps.
But there's got to be a way for people to communicate with each other. I mean, I think that's part of the problem, right? You mentioned all these different ways that people have all these different pipelines, et cetera, and the proprietariness of everything, right? You know, you already talked about Sony. Sony is famous for its proprietary proprietary memory cards, for God's sakes.
Oh
right?
my God, everything.
So, right. So they love proprietary stuff because they want you stuck into their ecosystem, which is, you know, the walled garden has become a famous saying now.
And dangerous.
It seems that the industry has rebelled against the walled garden in a big way. Right. And now you can see that people said, you know what, we are not going to do this. And USD, for example, and Material X seem to be like, okay, that is the new way to communicate. And you know 100%. What, if you are not embracing things like USD, fully embracing it, not just importing USD data and then after that ignoring the rest of the process, but fully embracing the USD process, then you are rejected as something, because people just don't want to deal with that. They only care about interoperability. How do you feel about that? And based on what you're just talking about, distribution, et cetera, how do you feel about USD as an example? It could be anything else that you might mention as becoming the new HTML.
Sure. I'll do back end first and then we'll switch over to Alex. So that way we can talk about the monetization side on it too.
Sure.
So internally, you're 100% correct. We're part of ASWF and the Python, all of those different fun foundations and things like that.
Sure.
Academy software. And I think the biggest thing that you're 100% correct. USD solves a ton of problems. Material X solves a lot of problems. And the biggest thing that you get out of it that I think is levels above is that you are no longer dependent on the fourth dimension when it comes to processing. Previously, when you had issues, so you can look at this entire processing path. So say you do this automated processing system and it's going through this pipeline, and then you need to go ahead and go, where during this process did something go wrong? You have this single file that can be imported in any final system and any, you know, if this is a Houdini person, this is a Maya person, this is a C4D person, they can see what has happened through this process, and then they can go ahead and segment that out and then continue on for massive processing. But the other part on that really comes to, like, at some point, you're right, human interaction needs to happen, and human interaction tools. And that's the big thing that you're hearing in even what I'm talking about. We're talking about pipelines and processes, which means that each of them have different tools and how the tools interact. Each tool is better at one thing versus another thing. Maya is famous for its animation capabilities. Cinema 4D for its broadcast. You know, in each one of these has different people, and of course Blender, you know, we're picking up Blender people. You can just shovel them in to every single production. They're just everywhere. And so how do you do that, and how do you add people in? So it really does come down to you're reducing the number of problems by reducing the infrastructure in need. What had previously been, you need 900 different tools because you're a this shop. No longer are you a this shop. Your tools are USD tools. So USD tools then become agnostic as to what this, and this is. It's just a process that sits on a file. And to say it's the next HTML, I think we all tried GLTF, and we all wanted it to be the next HTML. It had sadly so many limitations. The one thing that USD did that GLTF was not able to figure out very well was streaming data content out in an intelligent manner. Many of the USD readers can, instead of it being a individual massive download, they can split it off into these individual parts and pieces. So things like volumetric video are going to be much more capable when USD is a much more accepted file format. There's no reason not to on my side.
Sure.
Yeah, what I was going to add to this is we were at SIGGRAPH last week with NVIDIA. Yep. We were part of their Inception Innovation Zone. And I had a lot of conversations about USD. One of our fundamental,
NVIDIA certainly embraced it with Omniverse, right? So they were one of the first ones that we're all in. They built it from the ground up on USD, right?
Oh yeah,
absolutely. What we found at M&E is Omniverse is still not as pervasive as.
No, I'm not saying that it's an M&E product. I'm just saying that they embraced that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, you're 100% correct. I mean, they're all in. Even last year, the entire theme of NVIDIA's event last year was USD, right? Sure. And we know that, now that all the big players are on board, it makes a lot of sense for everyone to, migrate that direction. And a lot of people are trying to do it. What I will say though, you mentioned, all in versus, sort of doing just basic USD adoption. The reality is it's challenging. There are a lot of moving parts. And some of the conversations that we've had both at the show and as follow-up this week have included, issues like fundamental issues with like adopting this and expanding this into someone's existing workflow because they're not the enablement tools that are simple enough for someone to adopt and understand how it's applicable to their business, how to integrate it in a more simplified manner. And that's one of the areas that we're finding a lot of demand. That conversion side that I mentioned that we do, that's also helping people, convert their pipelines to, meet specific output needs, whether that is a USD pipeline or a cross media pipeline or some other variation. The reality is linear pipelines are going away, right? They just don't serve the purpose anymore because media has shifted so drastically from what it was before. And people need everything to be more flexible, more interoperable, more functional at the core. And that's where we aim to be a resource in the industry.
I think
what do you think? Go ahead.
Oh,
Tim.
Just before we move on, the one thing to think about is that the industry is doing an 8-year shoveling right now. We allowed USD to get out, and it was about 8 years before it started getting a certain amount of standardization that's on that. And so there are a little bit of flavors here and there for some of the early adopters that make a lot of the stories a lot worse than what you're actually seeing come out now. If you adopt vanilla USD, it is a pretty easy slip and slide between all of the different systems. If, on the other hand, you are Pixar and you have, very flavored version of this, it gets very difficult, very quick to integrate what one of those pipelines is capable of doing, which it can be absolutely massive because USD is anything you want it to be and everything all at once and at the same time.
Sure. But so was EXR, right? When EXR came out, it was always like you can shove a whole model into an EXR. Yep. Who cares, right? And but it didn't, right? And it's highly adaptable, highly adopted as the standard of high quality image formats, right? No one's using a TIFF or a TARG anymore, right?
Right.
So I'm not. So anyway, so I think that's the case, and to be honest, we were due, right? We can't keep using OBJs and FBXs anymore It's definitely due. But I think what's also interesting is that USD sort of dedicates the pipeline. It is built on pipeline concepts, right? Because of the way it's FBX is just get my shit from here to there. That's all it cares about. But USD, it's like, no, it's layered. It's got all kinds of stuff. It can incorporate stuff. So it's kind of interesting that it is open in a lot of ways. Based on everything else you're talking about, you mentioned the fact, you've got Gaussian splats and nerfs and all this other new types of data that's out there that's not polygons, right?
Yep.
So what do you think about USD and how that's going to change over time because of those new types of formats?
Sure. I mean, the biggest thing, I sat down with the original Pixar team that ended up getting hired up by NVIDIA to do the USD integration. And, I was trying to figure out what was the future. And I said the same thing as you, like, what can we do? How do we make this happen? And the thing that came out of it, and it was because I was originally looking at USD, like this big overarching, like it can be everything and things like that. And, at that point in time, when you're a pipeline guy, the last thing that you want is it to be everything. I want it to be this. I control draconian, nothing else.
Right.
So the one thing
and as developers, the worst thing is when it's everything, then everyone just tries to shoehorn their own stuff into it that only works for them. It's like, and that's the problem we've had with Material X. It's like, oh no, I'm just going to put my shaders in Material X. It's like, well, what about everyone else's, right?
Exactly. And then you go, okay, well then I got to make a converter for this and I got to make a converter for this and I got to do this. But the thing that he made very clear, and this was the best, like when my brain was able to like totally grok what was going on, is he goes, it's basically just a zip file with a manifest. And I was like, oh, I get it now. Okay, so it's a spreadsheet, or anybody who knows databases, it's literally a light database with all of the content that lives inside of this ever-expanding system. So when you then make changes to it, it's just another line in a table. And so I was like, I get it now. Now I can understand what I can do with this thing and how I can play with it. Because I work with databases and data all day long. So at that point in time, then when you're talking about what is the future, then the future is, then it becomes Gaussian splats, nerfs, all of this stuff, then become containered into the system. Like it all can be all put inside of it. The only thing that needs to get updated is, oh, you're on, the 2.0 version 2.1 now has Gaussian splat capabilities. And all it is plugins within systems. And so then render systems can read that. And certain groups will have the capabilities and certain groups won't have capabilities, just like any other interoperability will end up having. But the other best part on this, if you have a legacy system and you need to suck out data, knowing that you can do really crazy things like rip out that by turning it into a zip file or flipping it around and doing an export. If you don't have access to whatever system it was authored in, then you can do crazy things like, yank it out of a pipeline and shove it back in when you have that capability. So you're no longer limited to what's going on. So when you're talking about these new advanced techniques, you're no longer limited because it as a language continues moving. It's no longer just a file system or a file type. It is its own language and operating system that exists under the hood.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, and it's very complex and is very inclusive, as you mentioned, in a lot of ways. But you guys have interacted with the visual effects industry, obviously, over time. The visual effects industry is very picky about their data.
Yes.
Yes. Understatement of the year.
Right?
Yes.
So they want something that's a specific level of quality that's sub-pixel high quality. And they're like, we don't have to deal with all this. We don't care about interoperability as long as the pixel is perfect on the screen. So how has that worked for you? Like, how have you guys managed that? Or how do you feel about that in general?
Yeah, for us, I would say, our North Star has always been film quality content for everyone, which obviously, is kind of a tricky prospect for other industries, but film people get it. They're like, oh yeah, of course, we're like the best that there possibly is.
Right.
And so for us, a lot of it has been, okay, great. We needed to open up our system to accept a lot of different types of data because content gets created from everything, right? It's not just, people building models from scratch. It's also scan data, from LiDAR systems. It's photogrammetry, and it's a ton of other weird inputs. And capture is imperfect. That's what I'll say. It usually is sort of the hitch in processing that type of data. And so for us, we actually started this with volumetric video. So film quality, right? Volumetric video, very challenging. You're dealing with a terabyte of data for a minute of footage because you have multiple cameras and inputs. You have to time sync all of those, and then you're, digitizing that into a full 3D performance or object, right? And in motion. And so for us, starting with volumetric video had its own challenges, but I think it actually set us up for a lot of success as we added more types of data. We started with volumetric because we were using it heavily in our previous company, our XR studio. We were adding it into projects, adding in, characters, guides, real world humans that had been digitized, to interact in these virtual experiences. And it was challenging enough to get it onto, a VR headset and make it work functionally. But then we, had a great idea to scale it. That was a whole other set of problems. So, anytime you're scaling anything with that level of data, you have to be thinking about not just how you're going to intake the data, what you're going to do with it, how it's going to actually get cleaned up and tuned to be effective in the use case, and then where it's going to go play back. And that's why, Tim has mentioned sort of building it backwards, i.e., where is it going first? Because your data can be amazing and never play anywhere, right? Because the file format is wrong, or it's just too big, or some other, sort of nuance in the process. And so for us, it's been very focused on how do we make those choices so that we are more agnostic, because we obviously, as a tool, we don't want to dictate what kind of data comes to us. We don't want to dictate what kind of processes is going through. We did build some intelligence into the system so that an end user doesn't have to know all of the nuances that someone, of a pipeline TD caliber would know. But that's the beauty of it, right? It's like a pipeline TD in your pocket. It's intelligence built into a system that can help sort of distribute and break apart that linear process in a more functional way so that you can, data in, data out, playback is a much more simplified process.
Is there a way that you feel that the data can be, not one thing that rules them all, but just one system that rules it all, that like I can just get it for anything, right? That's what you're kind of implying here, right?
Yeah. I don't see it as you make this authored data and it's like the king data, and then it's got to do all of that. There will be times, as we talked about, that there are these 50 different silos, and these 50 different silos have different versions of it. What we're looking is you have to transmogrify that data. We're going from A to Z, and this is the workflow to rule them all that sits in the middle, and like how it does it really shouldn't matter to a marketing person. We have somebody who's in marketing. I got to do a couple of spots, and I got this thing from Tokyo Disney, and I've got to get out all of this data, and here's this, and like, how do I deal with that? Do they really need to know? Does it even matter to them? Like, no, they just need the content, and they need to know how to get content from content A to content B. And so being able to have this process and pipeline that then understands, whether they have a USD, they have an OBJ, they have something like that, but the output has to be X, Y, Z. It's a character. It's this many polygons because it's based off of this game. This is what we've agreed the hero assets are. Bada bing, bada boom. It just snakes for you.
Mm-hmm. You guys got into, I know, based on our conversations over the years, have got into virtual production. You saw natural need for some of the things you guys have been developing in virtual production. What were the things that you saw? What were the problems that you saw in virtual production, and why did you see that people needed a solution?
Absolutely. So virtual production is a really challenging arena because it is production coming together with real-time content, right? These are two very different ecosystems that need to functionally play together now. So for us, we've spent a lot of our careers and our company, work in real time. And so with that, we knew that there was an opportunity to bring those things together with a tool set. So for us, where we focus our tooling in this world is optimization. So, and quality assurance. So making sure that the content will effectively play back at frame rate is a consistent problem. No matter who the stage is, no matter where the content is from, it's always going to be an issue. Even if you have full control of your content, the idea of content creation is ultimately creative. But if you're hindered by performance, your creativity isn't going to actually, exceed expectation. It's only, it's stuck at a certain level at some point. And so for us, we wanted to build a tool set that could allow virtual production stages to test and make sure that their content will run at frame rate without having to spool up their stage and their resources and their teams. And then ultimately make sure that we could also automate and functionally deliver back assets with this optimization levels for meshes and textures. So that's sort of the low-hanging fruit on the optimization side. But what we're finding, the more and more, sort of conversations we have, the real problem is just understanding effectively what will run, what will not run. And then the team can handle it themselves, or they can automate some of that and save themselves a couple of days.
So for me, backwards, and my career was an artist that became an art director, then that became a technical artist, right? And then I end up focusing heavily on automated tools and optimization and device-specific optimization and things like that. Worked at Gameloft. That was like my entire job. I just sat down and made sure we hit frame rate. I remember sitting there and I'm serious. I loved it.
I know, it's funny just to think about that. Sitting there, it was the same was true in offline. Is like, is it under an hour? Is it under an hour? Is it under
right?
An hour? A frame.
Yeah, that was the same.
An
thing
hour a frame was my budget.
yeah, and that was how I started, because I wanted to originally be a shading and lighting artist, but that's like so hard to get into. That I was like, yeah, I'm good at making props, but I would sit there and like do that same thing. Like, okay, cool. Same. Okay, I have an hour and 45 minutes. You'd start playing the J curve. And I was like, okay, well, maybe if I make a render farm, then I can go faster. And like, so I had that geekiness in college where I was like trying to figure out how to do the same thing. How do you race the deadline? And the deadline really comes down to, let me chop down these things. But it really came down to, I would sit there, and as I'm doing optimization, the artists would always come and go, hey, look, we are trying to do X, Y, and Z thing. And how do we make it happen? A lot of times I would be brought in as the voice for the product itself. And it was an easier place for somebody who is doing optimization to sit there and go, well, hey, I understand you love your art. I understand you love your code. I understand you love your design. But if I go, well, I am just, this ivory tower that's sitting on the side going, well, it doesn't matter if the frame rate doesn't run. It doesn't matter if the content doesn't match our package size. None of that matters. This is the only thing that matters in the end, is delivery at X. Then when, I would get in conversations with people, and we would have ones like, the design team would come in and go, okay, we need 100-headed Hydra. And of course I'm looking over the art team, and, they're drawing, cats and like horses. I'm like, what do you got to do Hydras. How are we going to draw all those? And then you look over the dev team. They've already thrown a table at me. So like, we know you're going to make it happen. We hate this. Like, how are we going to do a 100-headed Hydra thing? And, I would sit down with them, and I would sit down with the art team, and I go, hey, cool. I'll make a head creating tool that'll speed up all of these things. And hey, art team, dev team, I'll make it to where all of these tools then fit together to where you don't have to worry about naming conventions and everything like that. And then I'd sit down with the render team, and I'd have to sit with them and go, okay, what's technically capable? And then I'd come back and I'd go back to design and go, hey, look, I did this for them. I did this for them. It's not everything everybody wants, but we get 89 heads. We good? And so you end up, right? Like, it's a game of negotiation in the end. And it's a lot of quid pro quo to make all of that work. But I started seeing that heavily inside of film, and I would sit down with them, and I'm like, it's just an Unreal game. What problem are you guys having? And they're like, well, it just doesn't run at frame rate. And then the thing that blew my mind came down at the very end of it is the thought that normally when you do optimization for a device, I'd have 3 of them on my desk. I'd have a dev kit. I'd have this. I'd have all that. I'm like, literally, I would have like a double desk because that's Tim's play area. But
sure.
In film, you can't do that.
Right.
I don't have access to the wall 24/7. I don't know any of that.
That has been a real, it's not a cheap thing to have.
Right? We got a wall just for every artist. No, you can't do that. And so being able to do that on top of the fact that you have an entire industry of people that go, and I'm not kidding. I was in a conversation. They're like, yeah, we made this rock here. And I'm like, that rock is the hottest color I've ever seen in my entire life. As I'm looking, how many polygons is that, guys? And they're like, oh, it's like 300K. And I'm like, that big, that little bitty rock, 300K. Your budget for the scene is about 1/3 of that. You've just used on a rock. Right. And so you have this massive movement. And the big thing is the art level from the game industry could not come up fast enough. Right. And so the idea is, well, let's do it the other way around. I can't train up an entire industry to take over what the jobs were originally real time for film. So then what would I have done if it was the other way around? If this was my team and I had to sit down and go, okay, how are we going to make this happen? I'd make tools, and I would sit there. And so that's why we would bring in all the real-time tools that we were playing with previously, just so you could get like volumetric video to run and like, oh, let's repurpose this. Let's do that. And then that's when the whole, like, this is how I have to make this crazy configurable pipeline had to come out, because it was like, sure, you're going to optimize it. And be like, how? What? You don't know what's coming in. You don't know how it's going to go out, but it's got to get onto the scene. It's got to run at frame rate. So just like, then you end up having to make a system that builds a system so that whenever the data comes in, you know what it is, how it is, and how it's supposed to look and how it's supposed to work. And then it can handle itself. So for me, it really was that heartfelt place where I really do like to sit down with artists and they're like, I can't do that, Tim. I don't know how to do it. And I'm like, yeah, here, let me make this little script for you. And they're like, hey, and then you're the nighttime dwarf who comes in and like, here you go. Yeah,
I made your data work. I made it work. Yeah. Now let's talk about this, because I'm going to go here. So we've got you've been very good at helping artists figure out how to get their stuff to run on a rasterized render.
Yes.
Right? Yes. And therefore you can help them deal with their polygon budgets and all those other things. Yep. Those problems are not the same when you're dealing with a ray trace solution, which is what we're doing with obviously with Vantage, right? So like I've been working on a virtual production project, which will be coming out soon. We'll keep an eye out in September. That we had the whole scene. It had 2.5 trillion polygons. I don't even care how many polygons it had, actually. That's the whole point. And so you want to make the big old 300K rock, fine, just make 1,000 of them. It doesn't matter, right? Because it's a different way of thinking. So that different way of thinking, by the way, that doesn't mean that there isn't other problems. There are. Correct. There are different ways of dealing, right? You deal with resolution is more of an issue than polygons. That's the whole thing with ray tracing. So how do you think about that? Like, how do you say, it's like, okay, there was a shift that happened around 2006 to 2008 in the visual effects industry, where they moved away from rasterized things and they moved to a completely ray trace solution, and their entire pipeline, like, oh, we built huge pipelines just to deal with optimization, and we don't have to deal with that anymore. We have to deal with new problems. How are you guys shifting to these new problems?
Well, it's funny. Around that time, that's when I was going through college. And so I was sitting there as we went from one to the other. So I had one leg in the original rasterized, and then when they brought in Mental Ray into Maya, and then of course Pixar released RenderMan, and I was sitting there with an oxygen card trying to figure out how to get ray tracing to work and how to speed that all up. And so the one thing that I realized as I was going from regular rasterization to ray tracing and ray tracing processing was it still conforms to the iron triangle. There are limitations no matter which way you go.
Oh, it's just a different part.
Oh, yeah, exactly. It's a different part. There's a different problem here. Instead of just as we've learned to do in rasterization, you would put all of your weight into textures because textures are easier. You do displacement maps and height maps and all of that stuff. And then if you're going to do ray tracing, then you want to go ahead and pre-calculate that because then you don't have to go ahead and pull from texture. You don't need to go into that area. And so where I entirely focus at that point in time, cool. Then I don't have to go ahead and worry about this section or sector of the pipeline. That's the cool thing of having these pipelines that build pipelines is it goes, okay, cool. Instead of me looking at optimizing this direction, I optimize this direction. In the end, it's the same thing that we talked about. That marketing person could give a flying monkey about where it's coming out. They just need to have it in the way that they do. And the same with the artist. They should only focus on making pretty. Let's make the pretty. Let's make it work. I don't see why they need to understand how many polygons are supposed to be in the scene and what file format it needs to do and why it's got to be blue instead of red. Oh, no, more blue, more blue. But in the end, what they really need to focus on is making what it's supposed to be the way it's supposed to. And then what you do is you throw it into the magic box and then it comes back out and it's pretty on the screen. Because you guys are making the pretty on the screen. We're making it go from the artist to the pretty on the screen. So, well,
that's part of the issue, right? I mean, I think right now there are entire departments called virtual art departments, and all they do is just making sure it runs at frame rate.
Absolutely.
Right? That's an expensive,
massively
expensive pipeline.
Absolutely.
A lot of people doing things that should be done through a more automated process, which I think is what you guys are talking about, right?
100%.
We've actually done some pricing, if you will, some price research based on the facts and figures that were in, I believe it was a Sony research paper that came out in about 2019. So still early VP, right? We're 5 years post that. But, it had cumulative, information around electricity costs and all kinds of very in-depth, everything. Just pressing start on your system, right? And then we added in, the cost for having your team. So based on our estimates, with this preliminary research that is a bit dated, ultimately it costs around $11,000 just to spool up the system and understand if your scene will run. And this is on sort of a large scale project with 3 techs. So 8 scenes, 3 techs. That is $11,000. And then you get into the optimization side, actually making it functionally run because it didn't after you checked it. And that is upwards of $16,000 for the same sort of 8 scenes, 3 turnarounds. And the reality is, $26,000 cost
per scene. To be clear, per scene.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the reality is, it's an excessively expensive cost that almost no one recognizes. Because optimization is it's just sort of looked at as a necessary evil at this point, right? Like, oh, it doesn't run. Why doesn't it run? We have to go through and, my most, the saddest one for me is when people are like, oh, we just deleted stuff. And I'm like, you what? Oh, these things that you're seeing, that's sad. But the option of having much broader ecosystem, tools that integrate into the workflow in a more cohesive and sort of seamless manner, rather than, what is today, the VP pipeline it's a lot of tools that have been repurposed from other industries and other use cases that have been sort of formed to work in virtual production most of the time. But what we're seeing now, whether you adopt the VP 2.0, sort of moniker, is we're seeing things that are purpose built for virtual production. So the optimization tool that we have, some of the tools that I know that you've been, working with, and I think we're going to continue to see that sort of above and beyond, these sectors. People want to work in the programs that they natively know, understand, and love, and they don't want to have to rebuild their pipeline every 5 minutes. But every pipeline is going to be unique. We know that too. Every single pipeline for every single studio is going to be unique. And having options is key.
Yeah. What do you think about that? I mean, obviously I know you guys are very tuned into I got a couple more questions. I know we're going to run a little long if that's okay, but what do you think about this whole problem of the game industry came in and say, we're going to take over virtual production. right? And they're like, we're going to do this. And by the way, I applaud that because there was no one there to take it, and it needed desperately to be done, right? Someone needed to take real time, because before that, all we had was Motion Builder, and boy, that did not look that great, right? And it's still, Motion Builder is a good tool, but not for something that looks good, high fidelity quality. So what do you think about the gaming industry coming in? And now, considering like about a year ago, Tim Sweeney at Unreal Fest basically is like, not sure we really want to get into the movie. We'll focus on games again. Like, what do you think about how that leaves the film industry and virtual production at this point?
Let's be honest, the industry latched onto it because nobody came from the industry with an answer, and the game industry came in and said, hey, you know what would be really cool if, and then the industry was like, yeah, let's do that, because there's a lot of leg time and a lot of lead time that it takes for an entire industry to move forward. And everyone, even in games, if you start up a studio, you're going to use one of the two bigs. You're either going to do Unity or you're going to do Unreal. And I think the industry wanted to do some really cool stuff, but they also wanted to put their feet in the water, so to speak, and dip their toes. And for them to do that, that means that then they'd have to turn around and create their own versions. They had to see what wasn't the best. And the film industry has to build tools for itself because it has very different needs than anywhere else. And so if you build for film, it'll work basically everywhere else, and not vice versa. I promise you that. I've seen both sides. And so I think the big thing is industry, keep moving forward on what you're doing. Start teaching people tools and how things work differently. And I think the parts that we are going to take as this Phoenix Ash movement, because that's what it is. I'm watching as studios are kind of crumbling and coming back with different ideas, comes down to how we interact as an industry. The one thing that we did that I think destroyed our industry was siloing the creatives, the intellectuals, and the DP. Everybody became, just kick it downstream, fix it in post, and just like, then it became this big snowball of just bleh. And you end up getting these movies that are all basically CG because there's no story. There's nothing in between.
No one could figure out what it was actually going to look like.
Nobody could figure out what was going on. Exactly. Yeah. And so people are going to come up with really interesting. I know there's this group called Chaos that's probably doing something cool and interesting, building something for the industry by the industry. So.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Because by the way, the reason that they all did it, the reason that everyone did Unity and Epic really sort of embraced this thing is they were promising the metaverse, right? That was a big word back when this was all going on, right? Yeah. And in order to do the metaverse, I have to have a solution that works in the film industry as well, because that's where all the IP comes from. So it was very interesting. That's what it was. And when the metaverse sort of was this hype cycle, right? Mm-hmm. Which is now sort of in a different position. Not saying that it's gone away, it's just in a different position. And we responded with this now with another push of AI stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So my question to you is, how is AI going to change your pipelines? And how is it going to change things like efficiency, where people are going to look at AI as a way to create efficiency as opposed to, just a smarter pipeline that's built by hand?
Yeah, no, we actually have a lot of deep AI tooling in our pipeline. So that includes the sort of foundational distribution of processes. Tim mentioned, understanding how processes are effective, where they need to go, sort of rearranging things so that it can get processed in the most effective way with the compute that's available. That's one piece of it. Training your system to be more effective based on the load types that you're dealing with of data is a great piece. And then, of course, there's a ton of other applications, everything from, color neutralization to stylizing, look. And then you get into, tools and algorithms that we've trained ourselves internally. So we have automated secondary maps, automated LODs, and a lot of other. We did actually release our first generative tool. We have a full text to plate solution that we launched about a month and a half ago. And the reality is AI is never going anywhere. It's a hammer. It's a handle, right? To build a house. The house that we're working to build is, how to integrate those things in the most effective way to enhance content and make the creator more effective. Those are really where I think that AI tooling and AI functionality should fit. I don't think of it at all as a creation replacement. I think of it as augmentation to make a human better. I use, ChatGPT as an example. I use ChatGPT basically every day just to like brainstorm things, whether that's copy or whether that's, sort of an outline for something or, things that I should be thinking about in a meeting I'm going to do, whatever the case is, it's just sort of something I, use for that fundamental outline so that I can have, an organization of thoughts, right? And we look at that, in our pipeline and our tooling, and we see that across the industry too. There are a ton of applications and implementations. One of the pieces that we've been asked about is the text to plate solution. Hey, what models are you using? And we're like, what models do you want to use? Because we're an API first solution. We are not intrinsically tied to any model or data set. We can checkbox the ones that you would like to use and uncheckbox the ones that you do not want to use. And so if you're suddenly like, okay, Shutterstock is good, Getty is good, can't touch the rest. Great. We'll just, switch out the pipeline check boxes, and you can use the ones that you had greenlit within your company that are, above board, whatever variation of, legalese is happening at that point with those data sets. Same thing, if you want to put in your own data set, great. We can do that and we can help you train it. The reality is it needs to be flexible, right? I've mentioned flexibility a few times, but flexibility is really important because it's a changing landscape and we don't really know what it's going to be 6 months down the road for, legal ramifications, data set compliance, all kinds of other, bits and pieces that still have yet to land essentially. And so I think that that's an important piece for people to think about as they're implementing these types of tools.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how people are going to not worry about certain things that they used to have to worry about, right? I was talking to Nicola over at Wonder Dynamics and sort of what he's been developing. It's like, there was like 25 people you need to get to before you get to do the things that you really wanted to do. And now you can sort of think about just getting there now and not having to worry about that process.
Agreed.
Yeah. Well, listen, it's been fascinating talk. Thanks you guys so much for doing this. I'd love to, if you guys have stuff that you want to talk about or announcements you're going to make in the future, give me a heads up so we can talk about it on the podcast. It'd be good to be able to have you guys back on that.
Thanks for having us.
Fantastic. Thank you.